balancing the nation's budget. The federal budget deficit is fast approaching $1 trillion a year, and yet the Senate overwhelmingly rejected a plan put forward by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul that would have balanced the budget in 5 years and cut spending by roughly $13 trillion over 10 years. Arguing against Senator Paul's penny plan on the Senate floor, South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham said it would threaten the military. Watch.
At the end of the day, this budget puts everything every defense person has been hoping for in jeopardy. It takes the efforts of President Trump to rebuild the military and throws it in a ditch. The $13.5 trillion being cut over the next decade, that a lot of it's going to come out of defense if it actually was a reality. If you take defense and Social Security off the table, it is a joke. Now is not the time to be funny. Now's the time to be serious.
Joining me right now is Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. Senator, thanks very much for joining us this morning. He says it's not the time to be funny. Your reaction to your colleague's criticism?
You know, I think Lindsey Graham's not really a conservative. I would call him a big government Republican. To him, feeding the military-industrial complex is his priority. It really isn't balancing the budget. But most Republicans, like Lindsey Graham, say they are for a balanced budget amendment. The amendment they have voted for says we would balance in 5 years. So I think there's a bit of hypocrisy in that they say, oh, yes, I'm for the balanced budget amendment, and they vote for it. But then when it comes to actually voting for a budget that balances in 5 years, they won't do it. The other thing that's wrong about what he's saying is the budget we put forward didn't have any specific cuts in the military. It cut 1% of the budget, and it's not really $13 trillion. 1% of the budget is $32 billion. The budget that we vote on is $3.2 trillion. 1% is $32 billion. You cut $32 billion every year for 5 years, and it balances. The $13 trillion number comes from the proposed increases. So they're proposing to increase government by $13 trillion. If you freeze government, they say, oh, you've cut $13 trillion. No, we haven't. We've frozen spending. And so what we're talking about is cutting spending by 1%. It's $32 billion. But you cut out all the proposed increases. That's where they get these large numbers. They were never real numbers. They're just numbers they want to increase government spending by.
What do you say to those people, though, who say, look, we needed to do this because we need the money for the military? Look at the Navy right now. 50% of the planes are not flyable because they need updating.
Right. I think there is an argument, a debate we should have in our country over whether or not the military budget is too small or whether our mission is too big. I think we're in too many wars. I think we've been in Afghanistan for too long. We spend $50 billion a year in Afghanistan, building bridges, building hotels that never get completed. My staff just came back, and we spent $90 million on a luxury hotel. Taxpayer money that was never completed is so dangerous that our troops now patrol it to keep snipers out of it. And you know what they're getting ready to do? They're going to sell it to the State Department. One part of government's going to sell it to another part of government, and the State Department's going to raise the whole thing. They're going to demolish this hotel. Will never be built. $90 million flushed down the toilet, but it's $50 billion a year. People like Lindsey Graham want to continue that forever. He's like, we must stay in Afghanistan forever. But I've talked to the president about this, and I think the president's more on my wavelength. President Trump says it's time that we reconsider, engagements like the 17-year war in Afghanistan.
Well, he also said that about Syria, and a lot of people feel that if you leave Syria right now, you open up a vacuum like we did in Iraq when President Obama pulled out of Iraq, and ISIS got strong.
But I think the vacuum was created by toppling Saddam Hussein. So the neocons, they say we should be everywhere and they want to topple Assad. So Lindsey Graham and the neoconservatives, they want to topple Assad. What will that be? A bigger vacuum that we will then either have to occupy that space or chaos happens. Yeah. They wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. They did, and now terrorism and civil war reigns in Libya. So the argument that those of us who want less intervention is that if you topple these regimes, you create the vacuum, and then you create the argument that the U.S. troops then have to stay forever. So I think we should quit creating chaos. We should defend ourselves when we need to over there. But for the most part, we need to keep people from coming into our country who wish to attack us.
I'm going to get back to this because I have another question on spending, and I know how important this is. So let me come back to this because I want to get to two more issues with you. I got to ask you about China, and I want to ask you about surveillance and the Trump campaign and how this investigation into the Russia collusion narrative actually began. An article in the Journal today, Kim Strassel wrote a great op-ed, called it, "Was Trump's Campaign Set Up?" Now, you have told me in the past that there were surveillance around you. You told me last year that you asked the intel committees if you were actually surveilled. Have you gotten any answers?
We asked repeatedly because there were rumors about specific conversations. In fact, there were rumors of specific conversations I had with President Trump before he was president, that there were contents of that conversation that were collected in intelligence reports. They deny it, and I was never given any information other than some incidental things of, like, you know, your credit card history being looked at or something. There was never, they say, any CIA surveillance of this. But we've asked Gina Haspel the same thing. Was I surveilled? But also, more importantly, was President Trump and others in the presidential campaign? She categorically denies that the CIA did anything, and she goes further, and this is pretty important. She says that they never cooperated with British intelligence. And I ask her specifically, did British intelligence give you information on the Trump campaign? And she says no. She said this to Richard Burr, who has now said to me that his word of honor is that he will vouch for what Gina Haspel said. No intelligence was given from the British intelligence to CIA on President Trump's campaign.
Was this when John Brennan was running the CIA?
Yeah, and the thing is that's big news, because I'm not so sure I believe what they're saying. I actually do think there is going to be information come out that the British intelligence, and they're going to say, oh, we were just accidentally, we weren't. You see, this is the nuance of words. They say, oh, we weren't spying on Trump, we were spying on someone else, but then we got up conversations, and then I think they did report those to Brennan. But Gina Haspel is categorically denying that they got information for the British intelligence. And if what I'm saying today is not her opinion, she needs to speak up today, and she needs to say, did British intelligence give information to John Brennan? Was there a meeting between the two where they exchanged information gained incidentally or otherwise about President Trump's campaign? I think they did.
Could she be unaware of it, and could it be that it happened at the FBI and the Department of Justice and not the CIA?
That's what I mean. The way these people answer you is they get a team of lawyers and they do everything to obscure the truth. They know what we want to know. Did British intelligence give information to the United States on the Trump campaign? Because the thing is that shouldn't be happening. The CIA will tell you we're not allowed to investigate Americans unless there's sort of an espionage charge or whatever. We're not allowed to investigate Americans. And so they said they didn't, but still the question is, are they obtaining information? You know, Kimberly Strassel's report talks about a working group. Yeah. All these different people at the CIA and the FBI getting together in a room and talking about how they can infiltrate the Trump campaign. I think there's a lot more that we're going to find out about this, but I think it's interesting that Haspel is now on the record denying all of it, denying that the CIA had anything to do with collecting information or receiving information from foreign intelligence, and that's a big deal, her response.
And they got a FISA warrant to spy on Carter Page, among other people. Do you think there's going to be accountability in this story? There was clearly an abuse of power at the top of the FBI.
I think one of the most important stories was right after the election, President Obama's team, many of the people said, oh, we're spreading this information. They were acting like they were angels, and they were going to spread information on Donald Trump throughout all of the intelligence agencies. Well, maybe they weren't angels. Maybe they were concocting a conspiracy to try to taint the new Trump administration by creating this narrative. But it's interesting. The only thing we really do know about communication with Russians is that the Clinton campaign bought and paid for a dossier that includes money that probably went to Russians. So the Clinton money probably went through Steele to his Russian contacts, and they created this sort of narrative that seems to be unsubstantiated.